Marcus Aurelius, Emperor of Rome, is writing, one unhurried line at a time, what the world will one day call Meditations, a work held up by four foundational pillars. First, the dichotomy of control. Second, the four cardinal virtues, wisdom, courage, justice, and temperance. Third, living in accordance with nature. The fourth, social duty and cosmopolitanism. Marcus Aurelius never meant it as a book at all. It was simply his way of talking himself back down to earth, night after night, and because what he discovered in that tent, by that small flame, is gentle enough to carry you all the way into sleep, and true enough to still matter centuries later, long after the lamp burned out. The first thing Marcus kept returning to, again and again, is the idea that everything which happens to you, everything in the whole wide tumbling world, can be sorted into two soft piles. One pile is the things that are actually yours, truly yours, under your own hand, and the other pile is everything else, the vast ocean of things that are not. The philosophers before him and his teachers and the old Stoic voices whispering down through generations of tutors and scrolls called this the dichotomy of control. But you do not need the hard word for it. You only need the feeling, and the feeling is a little like setting down a bag you didn't realize you were carrying. In your pile, the pile that is truly yours, there is your own judgment, the shape you give to your thoughts, your intentions, your choices, your reactions, the quiet inner decisions about what something means and how you will respond to it. That is all. Everything else, your body's aging, other people's opinions, the weather over the frontier, whether the harvest is good, whether someone insults you at dinner, whether the empire itself holds together or falls apart, all of that belongs to the other pile, the pile of things that are not yours to command, only yours to meet. Marcus wrote to himself, on nights very much like this one, that he should stop wasting his strength trying to grip the ungrippable. Let the world be the world. Let people be exactly as unpredictable and flawed and strange as people always are. Let the body do what bodies do, ache in the mornings, tire in the evenings, grow old the way all things grow old. None of that is a battle you were ever meant to win, because it was never truly yours to fight. What is yours, the only thing that was ever fully and completely yours, is the quiet room inside you where you decide what any of it means. And that room, that small warm room at the center of a person, is more than enough, is in fact everything if you tend it well. Feel that room now, if you can, the one just behind your ribs, the one no army and no illness and no unkind word can ever really enter unless you leave the door open for it. Marcus called this turning inward, this treating of your own mind as a fortress, a kind of internal focus, and he came back to it the way you might come back to a favorite blanket on a cold night. He would remind himself that a person could retreat into no quieter, no more untroubled place than their own soul, especially if they kept within themselves thoughts that, on being looked into, left them at once in perfect ease. He was not asking himself to withdraw from the world of duty and other people, not at all. He sat at the very center of that world, ruler of nearly everything visible from his tent, but he was asking himself to keep one small room always tidy and always his, a private study of the mind, so that no matter how loud or how cruel or how confusing the outer world became, there remained a place he could step into and simply breathe. Think of your own mind this way tonight. Think of it as a study with a good lamp and a closed door, a place you can enter regardless of what the day outside has been, regardless of the emails unanswered, or the arguments unresolved, or the small failures still stinging faintly under your skin. That room is always available to you. It was always available to him, even when messengers rode in with terrible news, even when the plague was moving through his legions, even when his own body was failing him in ways an emperor's medicine could not fully mend. Internal focus meant learning, patiently, the way you learn to fall asleep in an unfamiliar bed, that your peace does not have to wait for the world's permission. It can start from the inside, quietly, right now, like a candle being lit in a dark room. And paired with that turning inward, gently, like two hands folding together, was its outward twin, which Marcus called something like acceptance, though the word barely carries the calm weight of what he meant by it. If the things outside you are not yours to control, then the only sane response, the only response that does not exhaust you uselessly against a locked door, is to accept them as they come, the way you accept the fact that night follows day, the way your lungs accept air without arguing about its temperature. He wrote to himself that everything harmonizes with him, which is harmonious to the universe, that nothing is early or late, which is in due season for nature. And there is something enormously soothing in that thought if you let it settle over you like a heavy quilt. You did not choose to be born into this century, this body, this family, this set of circumstances, and yet here you are, and the wiser, softer response is not to spend your remaining hours quarreling with the fact of your own life, but to meet what comes the way a riverbank meets water, without resistance, shaping itself around the flow rather than being shattered by it. This does not mean lying down and giving up. Marcus never once suggested that he ruled and fought and administered and judged every single day of his adult life. But he did all of it while holding the outcomes loosely, the way you might hold a small bird in cupped hands, present, careful, engaged, but never crushing, never clutching. External acceptance is not surrender. It is closer to trust, a trust that the larger pattern of things, even when it hurts, even when it takes people you love, even when it disappoints you, is still part of something whole. And your job was never to control that whole, only to play your small, honest part inside it. Out of these two things together, the fierce tending of your inner room and the soft-handed acceptance of the outer world, something wonderfully clean begins to grow, and Marcus called it, in his own quiet way, mental clarity. It is what is left over once you stop wasting your attention on things that were never yours to move. Imagine a lake that has finally been left alone long enough for the mud to settle, so that even though the same water is there, you can suddenly see straight down to the bottom, see the stones, see the little fish moving unhurried through clear light. That is what a mind looks like once it stops churning over things outside its control. Marcus would remind himself, almost like a man patting his own pockets before leaving the tent, to strip away the unnecessary, to ask of every troubling thought whether it was truly about a real, present, controllable thing, or whether it was simply an old opinion dressed up as a crisis. Very often, he noticed, it is not events that disturb us, but our opinions about events. And once you see that clearly, an enormous weight seems to lift off the evening air. You are not troubled by the fact that someone was rude to you. You are troubled by the story you immediately tell yourself about what that rudeness means, whether you are respected, whether you are safe, whether you matter, and none of those stories were forced on you the way the rudeness itself was. You can set the story down. You can look at the bare fact instead, small and manageable, and let the elaborate emotional architecture around it quietly dissolve. This is what mental clarity felt like to Marcus at the end of a long day, not the absence of feeling, but the absence of unnecessary fog, so that whatever feeling remained could be looked at honestly, without exaggeration, without spiraling, the way you might look at a single candle flame rather than the whole dark room around it. Now let your mind drift a little further, the way it drifts just before real sleep, toward the second great pillar Marcus kept building inside himself night after night, which was not a single idea so much as four sturdy pillars of character standing shoulder to shoulder, old friends really, the four cardinal virtues that the Stoics before him had already been polishing for centuries. He did not invent them. He inherited them the way you inherit your grandmother's good sense, and he simply kept returning to them, checking himself against them the way a sailor checks the stars, because in the middle of ruling an empire and burying friends and fighting wars he never wanted, these four qualities were the compass that kept him from losing himself entirely. The first of the four was wisdom, which for Marcus was never about being clever or well-read for its own sake, though he was both, but about seeing clearly what was actually good, actually bad, and actually indifferent in any given moment, and choosing your actions accordingly. Wisdom, in his quiet framework, meant not confusing wealth or fame or comfort with true goodness, and not confusing poverty or pain or disgrace with true badness, but reserving the words good and bad only for the state of your own character, your own choices, your own inner alignment with reason and virtue. Everything else, the whole glittering or grim parade of external circumstances, was neither good nor bad in itself, only material to be used well or used poorly. A wise person, he told himself, is someone who sees this clearly enough that they are no longer thrown around by fortune's small daily storms, because they have already located the one thing that truly matters, and it was never out there in the weather of events. It was always here, in the quality of one's own soul. The second pillar was courage, though Marcus rarely thought of courage as something loud or dramatic, not the kind of courage that charges wildly into battle for glory's sake, but the quieter, more exhausting kind, the courage it takes to simply keep doing your duty day after day, without flinching, without excuse, even when your body aches and your heart is tired, and no one is watching closely enough to applaud you for it. He wrote to himself about doing every act of his life as if it were his last, freed from carelessness, from passion clouding reason, from hypocrisy, from discontent with his portion. And there is a steady, unglamorous bravery in that, the bravery of showing up honestly to an ordinary Tuesday the same way you would show up to a battlefield. Courage for him also meant facing the hard truths about existence itself without flinching away into comforting illusions, facing aging, facing loss, facing the eventual certainty of his own death, and doing so with steady eyes rather than pretending, the way frightened people sometimes do, that none of it is really happening. There is something very peaceful, oddly enough, in that kind of unflinching honesty, the way it can be more restful to finally stop running from a fear than to keep sprinting from it forever. Courage, in Marcus's quiet sense, is simply the willingness to remain present, awake, and engaged with your life exactly as it is, rather than the life you wish you had instead. The third pillar, justice, mattered enormously to him, perhaps more than any of the others, because he believed all the way down in his bones that human beings were made for one another, the way hands are made to work together, or the upper and lower rows of teeth, and that any life lived only for oneself, cut off from that natural cooperation, was a kind of self-inflicted wound. Justice for Marcus was not primarily about courts and punishments, though as emperor he certainly dealt with those too. It was about the daily, hourly practice of treating every person you meet fairly, honestly, and with their own dignity intact, giving each person what is actually due to them, not what your irritation or your pride or your convenience might prefer to give them instead. He would remind himself, in the privacy of his notebook, to do nothing thoughtlessly or without a purpose that was in keeping with the fair and good, to remember that being angry at people or dismissing them is itself a kind of injustice, a failure to treat them as the reasoning, striving, imperfect fellow creatures they actually are. Justice in his hands became something soft and daily rather than harsh and occasional, less like a judge's gavel and more like the constant small adjustments a person makes to keep their footing steady on uneven ground, a continual leaning toward fairness in every ordinary interaction, with the slave as much as the senator, with the stranger as much as the friend. And the fourth pillar, temperance, was perhaps the quietest of them all, the one most suited to a sleepy hour like this one, because temperance is simply the art of not being pulled around by every gust of desire or aversion that passes through you. Marcus lived, after all, at the absolute summit of luxury, with every pleasure the ancient world could offer laid out for his taking, and yet he wrote to himself constantly about simplicity, about not letting the palace and its comforts seduce him into forgetting what actually mattered. Temperance meant moderation, not as grim self-punishment, but as a kind of freedom, the freedom of a person who is not owned by their own appetites, who can enjoy a good meal without needing it, who can appreciate beauty without clinging to it, who can rest without collapsing into idleness, and can work without becoming a slave to ambition. He wanted, more than almost anything, to keep his own soul from being dragged around like a puppet by pleasure on one string and pain on the other, and temperance was the steady hand that kept those strings loose enough to let him move freely, guided by reason rather than yanked by craving. There is something very restful in that image, a puppet whose strings have finally gone slack, resting easy at last, no longer jerked this way, and that by every small want that wanders through. Let these four pillars settle now: wisdom seeing clearly, courage standing steady, justice reaching fairly toward others, temperance holding desire loosely, like four gentle weights pressing you down softly into the mattress, and let your thoughts drift toward the third great current running through Marcus's private notebook, which was his sense of living in accordance with nature, an idea that sounds almost like a modern yoga class, but meant something far larger and stranger to him. Something closer to feeling yourself as one small, warm, temporary thread inside an unimaginably vast and orderly tapestry. Marcus believed, following the old Stoic cosmology he had absorbed from his teachers, that the universe was not chaos, not an accident, not a cold and indifferent machine grinding along pointlessly, but a single living, breathing, rational whole, something he sometimes called nature and sometimes called the whole, and sometimes, in his gentler moments, simply called the gods, though he was never rigid about the exact name for it. Everything that happened, he believed, happened as part of an unbroken chain of cause and coherence, everything connected to everything else the way threads in a single piece of woven cloth are connected, so that even the things that felt like disasters to him personally, the plague, the deaths of his own children, the endless wars he never wanted, were still, somehow, part of the larger weaving, still contributing to a pattern too vast for any single person, even an emperor, to see whole from the inside. There is something enormous, and yet oddly comforting in that thought, the way looking up at a truly dark, star-filled sky can make your own worries feel smaller without making you feel small in a diminished way. More like feeling small the way a single note feels small inside a great piece of music, necessary, connected, part of something that could not sound the same without you, and yet was never only about you either. Marcus would remind himself to think often of the swiftness with which all existing things, and especially the affairs of human beings, disappear and vanish away. And he did not say this to be gloomy. He said it the way you might gently remind a child that the ice cream is going to melt, so they should enjoy it now rather than mourning its coming end. Everything in his vision was in motion. Everything was becoming something else. The whole universe an endless river of change. Matter borrowed briefly and then returned. Forms rising and dissolving the way clouds gather and drift apart across an evening sky. He would picture in his most poetic moments all the emperors before him, all the great and terrible men of history, now simply dust and a name, sometimes not even a name. And rather than finding this frightening, he found in it a strange, cool relief, the relief of realizing that his anxieties, his ambitions, his small daily irritations were themselves part of that same vast passing river, and did not need to be carried with such tight, white-knuckled grip. Living in accordance with nature also meant, for Marcus, a deep and repeated acceptance of fate, what the Stoics sometimes called amor fati, a love of one's own fate, though he arrived at that love slowly, through practice, the way you arrive at trusting a new bed after several nights of tossing in it. He would tell himself that whatever happens to you has been prepared for you from all eternity, and that the very texture of causes was from everlasting spinning the thread of your being. And this was not fatalism in a defeated sense. It was closer to the deep exhale you give when you finally stop fighting the current of a river and let it carry you, discovering, to your surprise, that the current was actually taking you somewhere sensible all along. This did not mean he stopped trying, stopped planning, stopped exercising his own judgment and effort. Remember, his own inner room was still entirely his to tend, but it meant that once effort had been made and the outcome had landed, whatever the outcome was, he tried to meet it the way you might meet weather, without the exhausting extra layer of feeling personally betrayed by the sky for raining. Acceptance of fate in his hands became less about passivity and more about economy, the economy of not spending your limited emotional energy fighting battles that were already decided, so that you had more of that energy left over for the battles that were still genuinely yours to fight, namely, again and again, the battle of how you would respond. And woven right through this cosmic vision was his constant, gentle attention to impermanence, which is perhaps the most sleep-friendly of all his ideas, the one that sits most naturally alongside a heavy blanket and a dimming lamp. Marcus loved to remind himself, almost like counting sheep, of how briefly anything lasts, how a man's life is but a point, his substance in flux, his senses dim, his whole bodily composition subject to corruption, and fame after death is only oblivion. And yet again, this litany was never meant to frighten him into despair. It was meant to soften his grip, to loosen the tight fists most people carry around without even noticing. Fists clenched around reputation, around outcomes, around being right, around being remembered. If everything passes, he reasoned, then the wisest use of the small bright interval you are given is not to spend it clutching, but to spend it well, doing the next right thing with full attention, the way you might savor the last warm minutes before sleep rather than resenting that the day is ending. There is a lovely, quiet freedom in impermanence once you stop fighting it. The freedom of knowing that no single moment, good or bad, painful or joyful, needs to be gripped forever, because none of them were ever going to stay forever anyway. Let that same freedom loosen your own hands now, wherever you are holding onto something too tightly tonight, and let it rest, just for a while, the way Marcus tried to let his own worries rest against the vastness of the whole. There is one more current left in his quiet nighttime writing, the last of the four pillars, and it might be the warmest of them all, the one most like a hand resting gently on your shoulder as you drift towards sleep, and that is his deep, almost startlingly modern sense of social duty and what we might now call cosmopolitanism, though he simply thought of it as remembering his true citizenship. Marcus wrote to himself that as Antoninus, his city and his country was Rome, but as a human being, his city and his country was the whole world, the entire cosmos, and there is something wonderfully expansive in that small shift of identity, moving from a citizen of one place to a citizen of everywhere, the way a person might move from clutching a single blanket to realizing the whole night sky belongs to them too. He believed, following his teachers, that all rational beings, everywhere, across every nation and every era, shared in the same universal reason, the same underlying spark, so that a stranger from a distant province was not truly a stranger at all, but a kind of distant relative, connected to him by the same invisible thread that connected every human mind to the great rational order of the universe. This sense of human kinship was not sentimental for him, it was almost mathematical, almost architectural, a structural fact about reality rather than a nice feeling he was choosing to have. And because of that, it held up even on his hardest days, even when the humans in front of him were rude or foolish or cruel. Out of that kinship grew his quiet, constant orientation toward the common good, an idea he returned to so often it became almost a private mantra, that what is not good for the swarm is not good for the bee either, that a person cut off from other people, living entirely for themselves, was like a limb amputated from the body, still technically alive perhaps, but severed from the very thing that gave it purpose and meaning. He did not see his duties as emperor, the endless correspondence, the judgments, the wars, the long nights of administration, as separate from his philosophy. He saw them as its very fulfillment, the place where wisdom and courage and justice and temperance actually got to walk around in the daylight and do something useful. Waking each morning, he would remind himself, almost like someone gently talking themselves out of bed on a cold day, that he was rising to do the work of a human being, and why then should he be annoyed at going to do the things he was made for, the things for the sake of which he had been brought into the world? There is something quietly encouraging in that thought for anyone facing a difficult morning ahead, the reminder that contributing to the people around you is not a burden layered on top of a good life, but is itself one of the main ingredients of a good life, the way flour is not something added to bread, but is simply part of what bread is. And finally, threaded through all of this, was a kind of radical tolerance that feels almost startling coming from an absolute ruler with unlimited power to punish anyone who displeased him. Marcus wrote to himself over and over in different words on different nights that it was possible and necessary to love even the people who wronged him, because they were acting out of ignorance, mistaken about what was truly good, stumbling in the dark the way anyone stumbles when they cannot see clearly, and that the correct response to someone else's confusion was not fury, but a kind of patient, almost parental compassion. He reminded himself that when men are inconsiderate towards him, he could go back at once to himself and ask what good there was still to find in the situation, and that it was in his power to feel no evil, even if someone else had truly done him wrong, because his own peace did not have to depend on other people's behavior, only on his own response to it. This was not weakness. It took, as he saw it, enormous strength, the strength of a person choosing patience when anger would have been so much easier and so much more immediately satisfying. He believed that anger itself was a kind of self-harm, that it hurt the angry person far more than it ever hurt the target of their anger. And so this radical tolerance was, in a strange way, simply one more expression of that same self-tending internal focus he had begun with. The same fortress of the mind kept peaceful and unbreached, extended now outward into how he treated every single person who crossed his path, friend or enemy, senator or slave, Roman or foreigner. So here, in the quiet flicker of that small imagined lamp, all four pillars finally stand together, leaning against one another the way tired travelers might lean together around a low fire. There is the dichotomy of control, the simple sorting of the world into what is truly yours and what is not, the turning inward to your own fortress of judgment, the soft-handed acceptance of everything outside that fortress, and the clean, settled clarity that follows once you stop fighting battles that were never yours to win. There are the four cardinal virtues: wisdom seeing clearly what actually matters, courage remaining steady and present without flinching from hard truths, justice reaching fairly and honestly toward every person you meet, and temperance holding your own desires with a loose, unclenched hand. There is the vast, quiet vision of living in accordance with nature, feeling yourself as one small warm thread inside an endless, orderly, ever-changing tapestry, accepting your fate not as defeat but as trust, and letting the plain fact of impermanence loosen your grip on everything, including your own fear of loss. And there is the warm outward reach of social duty and cosmopolitanism, remembering that your truest citizenship belongs to the whole human family, that your own good is bound up completely with the common good, and that even the people who wrong you deserve, in the end, more patience than punishment. Think for a moment longer, if your mind is still willing to wander a little before it lets go completely, about how strange it is that a man with legions at his command, with treasuries and provinces, and the loyalty of an entire world stretched from the mists of Britain to the deserts beyond the Euphrates, spent his quietest hours not plotting further conquest, but gently disarming himself, piece by piece, of exactly the things that power usually inflates. He was not writing to be admired for his humility. He was writing because he genuinely needed to, the way a person needs to breathe out after holding their breath too long underwater. Picture him again in that low tent, the lamp guttering slightly in a draught, and notice how often his own words to himself sound less like commandments and more like a friend murmuring reassurance to another friend who cannot sleep. He tells himself more than once that it is enough to attend to what is right in the present and that he does not need to be anxious about the whole of his life at once. Only this hour, only this task, only this single breath, taken carefully, and then the next one after it. There is a wonderful mercy hidden inside that instruction, because so much of what keeps a person awake at night is not any single problem, but the terrible feeling of trying to hold an entire life, past regrets, and future fears all at once, in two exhausted hands. Marcus, again and again, gently sets that impossible burden down. He reminds himself that the present is the only thing a person actually loses when they die, since the past is gone and the future is not yet owned. And so the wisest use of attention is always simply this moment, whichever moment happens to be in front of you, however small, however unremarkable it might feel. Let that same permission settle over you now. You do not have to solve tomorrow tonight. You do not have to relive every mistake from years ago in order to finally rest. There is only this quiet room, this soft weight of blankets, this one breath, and then the next, exactly the way Marcus discovered, tent after tent, campaign after campaign, that presence itself could become a kind of shelter when nothing else was steady. He would return on difficult nights to a very old idea he had inherited and made entirely his own, the idea that the mind, left undisturbed, is like a spring of fresh water, and that as long as a person keeps digging down to that spring rather than letting the surface become muddied by other people's opinions or by their own careless thinking, clear water will keep rising again and again, no matter how many buckets are drawn from it. He liked this image because it meant that peace was renewable, not a fixed reservoir that could run dry and leave you stranded, but a living source, always available, provided you kept returning to it rather than wandering off toward the muddier, noisier waters of anger or envy or fear. Notice that word, renewable. You are allowed, on nights when you feel entirely emptied out, to trust that the spring is still down there, still clear, still yours, waiting only for you to stop disturbing its surface long enough to see it again. There is also something tender in how Marcus thought about the people he shared his life with, and it is worth lingering on before you drift the rest of the way into sleep, because it softens even further that grand cosmic picture of threads and tapestries into something small enough to hold in your hands. He kept lists in his private notebook of the good qualities he had learned from particular people in his life: his grandfather's gentleness, his mother's piety and generosity, his tutor's patience, his adoptive father's steadiness and freedom from vanity, and there is something quietly moving about an emperor spending his rare private hours not cataloguing his own achievements, but cataloguing his gratitude toward others. This too was part of his sense of social duty, not an abstract philosophical position held at arm's length, but something as close and warm as remembering a particular kindness shown to him decades earlier, still glowing faintly, still shaping who he had become. He believed that no person becomes good alone, that every virtue we manage to grow in ourselves was first modeled for us by someone else: a parent, a teacher, a friend, sometimes even a stranger glimpsed only once, and that gratitude toward those people was itself a kind of virtue, a quiet acknowledgement of the invisible threads connecting one life to countless others. If you have people like that in your own life, teachers or parents or friends whose steadiness once showed you what steadiness could look like, let their faces drift gently through your mind now, not as a task, just as a soft kind of company on the way down into sleep. Marcus also had a great deal of patience in his private writing for his own repeated failures, and this too is worth carrying with you tonight, because so many people torment themselves at exactly this hour, replaying the day's mistakes, rehearsing better versions of conversations already finished, punishing themselves for falling short of some imagined perfect self. He knew that feeling well. He was not, by his own frequent admission, naturally patient, naturally even-tempered, naturally wise. He had to practice these things daily, deliberately, the way a person practices an instrument, hitting the wrong note again and again before the right one finally comes easily. He reminded himself that it was not fitting to be depressed, or anxious, or fault-finding, or suspicious about his own capacity to do what was right, but rather to simply try again, calmly, without the added cruelty of self-punishment layered on top of the original mistake. There is enormous relief available in that small shift. The shift from thinking a mistake proves you are fundamentally broken to thinking a mistake simply means tomorrow offers another attempt, another honest try, another small correction added quietly to the long, imperfect, ongoing work of becoming a slightly better version of yourself than you were yesterday. He did not expect perfection from himself, only continued effort, and that is a far gentler standard to fall asleep beneath than the impossible one so many of us secretly carry. And so, as this long, slow unspooling of his private thoughts draws finally toward its own quiet close, imagine one more time that small tent by the dark river, the lamp now burned down almost to nothing, the wax tablet finally set aside, the emperor himself, tired in the particular way that comes only from a whole day of trying honestly to do right by other people, finally letting his own eyes close. He does not know, as he drifts off, that his private notebook will somehow survive the centuries, will be copied and recopied by careful hands he will never meet, will end up, eventually, resting on nightstands very much like the one near you right now, read by people living lives he could never have imagined, in cities that did not exist yet, speaking languages that had not yet been born. He was not writing for any of that. He was only writing to steady himself, one more time before sleep, the way you are perhaps steadying yourself right now, letting these same old, patient ideas settle over you like a familiar blanket, the dichotomy of control loosening your grip on everything that was never truly yours, the four quiet virtues standing gently at the four corners of your character like old watchful friends, the vast, orderly, ever-changing universe holding you softly the way it held him, and the wide, Warm sense of belonging to the whole human family, reminding you that you were never really alone in any of this. Not on that cold frontier 18 centuries ago, and not tonight either. None of this, Marcus would probably want you to remember as your eyes finally close, was ever meant to be achieved perfectly or all at once, or even by morning. He himself failed at it constantly, which is exactly why he kept writing the same reminders to himself, night after night, year after year, a man talking himself gently back onto a path he kept wandering off, the way anyone drifting towards sleep drifts pleasantly in and out of focus, catching themselves, settling again, catching themselves again. There is no test at the end of this, no grade, no judge waiting to see whether you absorbed it all correctly. There is only the quiet, repeatable practice of it, the same small nightly return to your own inner room, the same soft acceptance of whatever today actually was rather than what you wished it had been, the same gentle reach toward wisdom and courage and justice and temperance, the same wide, cosmic exhale of knowing you are one small, connected, temporary thread inside something vast and orderly, and in its own strange way, kind. Let the lamp in that old tent burn down now. Let the wax tablet rest against Marcus's knee. Let the cold river outside keep moving quietly through the dark, the way it moved long before he arrived, and the way it moved long after he was gone, dust and a name, as he always knew he would become. And let that same slow, patient river carry you too gently all the way down into sleep.